There we go. Should we get going?
Yeah, let's get going. I know we have a lot of great stuff to talk about today, so let's start. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We were just chatting with Jake for a little bit, and already I have goosebumps. Really excited about this conversation today. So we want to start just by, as we always do, by taking a moment to express our deep, heartfelt gratitude for this land upon which we live, work, and play. So this is the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people that is largely comprised of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Indigenous elders, both past, present, and I'm quite certain to the future, have been the traditional custodians of this land, and we are deeply, deeply grateful. So we're excited today to be offering our third webinar. We've had a bit of a soft launch before we really want to hit the ground running next year. And we're really delighted today. As I mentioned, we've got a really exciting guest. He already said to us he's feeling spicy this morning, so that bodes well, I think, for our conversation. Jake Sticka, who is the founder of Next Gen Men. So Next Gen Men, well, he's the executive director. And so let me tell you a little bit about Jake before he starts sharing some of his insights and experiences. Jake is passionate about changing the way we see, act, and think about masculinity among youth, in communities, and at the workplace towards a future where boys and men experience less pain and cause less harm. Jake has earned recognition from Avenue Magazine's Top 40 Under 40, Ashoka,
yeah, I'm on a call,
the British Council, and the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. He has spoken at the United Nations as part of the Canadian delegation and has also served as a proud advisor to the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association, Canadian Women in Sport, as well as Men And. Thank you, Jake, for being with us today. We're really excited. Our presenters today are the three of us have joined forces, so Dignity and Leda HR. Elisabeth Cook, who is the founder of Dignity, co-founder and CEO of Dignity Technologies. We'll advance the slide, please, Malika. She's a trusted advisor to government, organizations and associations, and industry. As a lawyer by training, she specializes in diversity management. She provides commentary and analysis for major media organizations, including CTV, global and post-media outlets, on the issues of diversity and inclusion. And just a quick plug, Elisabeth's organization, Dignity, does really wonderful work around data collection and analysis, and in particular, the intersectionality of diversity demographics. Next up is my partner and wonderful friend, Annika Lofstrand, founding partner of Leda HR. Our consulting practice is grounded in human resources and guided by a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Annika looks to build skill and internal capacity wherever possible and to create opportunities for great conversations. She has a BA with a focus on Indigenous anthropology, a post-diploma in human resources, and is committed to work that supports welcoming, inclusive, and respectful workplace cultures. And me, it's so weird to introduce myself, but here we go. Also a founding partner in Leda HR. I have over 20 years in human resources and 10 dedicated to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I've led work in DEI strategy design, intercultural competency, mental health advocacy, and psychologically safe and healthy workplaces. I hold an award of achievement in DEI from UBC, and I am endlessly curious. So I am going to now pass this over to my awesome friend, Elisabeth, who is going to lead the conversation.
Thanks, Kristen. And thanks everyone for joining us. I noted before that we're going to record the session so we can share it with folks, but we'll have a section at the end for questions and answers. So if there's a question that you want to ask that you don't want to have recorded, either the question or the answer, you can save it for then. Otherwise, we're going to get going. Jake, I'm so excited to be chatting with you. And there's three main topics that I want to dig into and sort of float our conversation around. And one of the big ones, and it's actually the first thing that really stood out to me when I met you ages ago, and how our conversation went, was around the language that we use. We've often, when we talk about gender equity, and the conversation can be a little bit binary about sort of just talking about men and women. I think it's important to acknowledge that we're not addressing men and women or male, female, like as a binary. We're looking at it as a spectrum. But we often use the language of men being allies, to allies to women, allies to try to, advance this idea of gender equity. But I've heard you use the term shareholders and having men be shareholders in the conversation. And I would really like to hear more about what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so pleased to be with you all today. I apologize if there's background noise. I'm joining from a hotel lobby. And the reason I was feeling spicy is I was at a talk this morning, and one of my mentors and role models in this space was there, and he was talking, so a little fired up. But actually, if we're talking about language, actually the preferred term that I use is stakeholders. And so I'll kind of walk you through my issue with male allies, and then where I hope we land on this idea of stakeholders. And male allies, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We all know what we're talking about when we hear that phrase, and when we're inviting men to take up those positions of leadership and those types of things. However, I think we fall short of the real conversation. And to be an ally means that you have more power and privilege than someone else, and you're leveraging that power and privilege for the benefit of this other person, this other group, this whatever the situation is. But we're not talking about actual reflection of why we have that power and privilege, and dismantling, rethinking, changing that structure that affords us that privilege to begin with. And so when we don't do that, what we're actually practicing is this idea of benevolent sexism. Women should be protected or put on a pedestal or not treated that way. But we're not talking about closing the wage gap. We're not talking about working for women. We're not talking about taking our own roles in parental leave to make the motherhood penalty go away, right? Like we're really just practicing this paternalistic, chivalrous belief of like doing something right by someone else. So that's where I think the conversation kind of falls a bit short when we have those male allies conversations. And when I think about where we could go, we could talk about, this beneficiary argument, which I think is like the next piece of like, there's this fundamental question that we all have of like, what's in it for me? And it's kind of this give and take. And we talk so much about how patriarchy as a system benefits men at large. And we really hammer that home. And then if we think about behavioral psychology, we're far more likely to act to prevent a loss than we are to invest in a gain. And so if all the messages are about how patriarchy benefits men, earning positions of power, influence, media, all these types of things, and then you say, well, you need to give that up. Why would you give that up? You feel that loss, right? So where I want us to move with the stakeholder conversation is then talk about how, okay, fine, patriarchy bestows a benefit upon us men at large, but it harms each of us individually, deeply in different ways, right? 3 out of 4 suicides are men. 85% of deaths of despair are men. Men are the primary perpetrators of all forms of violence, and aside from gender-based violence, they're actually the #1 victims of all forms of other violence at the hands of other men. We're steeped in a culture of competition and domination. We're socially isolated. We have a hard time forming healthy relationships with our children, with our partners later in life. Being vulnerable, creating new friendships, like those are harms of patriarchy. And so again, back to that behavioral psychology piece, like those are losses that we can take action to prevent, right? And so we have a stake in this conversation. And I'm a feminist, and Next Gen's a pro-feminist organization, but that is a giant F word for so many people of like, I'm not going to get involved in this. So for me, okay, maybe you're not quite there yet, but can I get you to see that, patriarchy is the system and the structure that harms all people of all genders? Yes, some people benefit within the system and structure too, but you have a stake in changing this for yourself. And when we're self-motivated, we're far more likely to sustain our engagement than we are when we're doing kind of a favor, a solid to someone else, which I think is is a little bit of the allyship conversation.
Yeah. So I'm in the choir, obviously. I would like to see all men be feminists and understand that there's a lot of benefit for them to come to the table. And when I heard you start talking about like the stats, you know, especially like the suicide and the harm that comes to men, and how, you know, there is an opportunity to shift that culture if we all shift our mindsets and if men shift their mindsets. But I can't help but feel like there's an element there where we're asking men to be vulnerable, to say, like, I am at risk of that, or I know that those things are bad and they happen to me. I'm wondering if there's resistance there, because to me, your pitch rings true, but I'm in the choir. Is there still a reluctance? And like, what does that look like? And, you know, how can men, you know, maybe shift their perspective to embrace it more? Because my experience generally is asking people to be vulnerable is very challenging.
Just because I can see their faces, and I appreciate y'all being on camera, but I see Ken, Greg, and Thomas here. And if we could just do like a thumbs down, thumbs up, thumbs down activity. Have any of you as men, and then we see Robert Sinclair on here as well too, as men, have any of you lost a man in your life to suicide? Okay, 50% of the guys on the thing here. Have any of you experienced homophobic comments like "that's so gay," "you're so gay," those types of things based on how you performed your masculinity? 100%. Have any of you been like feminized, like you throw like a girl, or don't be such a B word, because of how you performed or showed up in a men's space? No, like 75% there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have any of you felt like masculinity in like sports or in work or those types of things was a culture of competition and probably tipping over into domination? 100%, right? And so thank you for indulging me in that activity. Guys know this stuff, right? And in our individual conversations, we can have that, but there's a lack of male leadership in having these conversations in the spaces they need to happen. And like you said, you're part of the choir. I'm preaching to the choir.
Mm-hmm.
How are we getting into those spaces where these conversations aren't happening? The locker room, the boardroom, the workshop, right? And who's leading in those spaces? Because the difficulty is that, you know, a lot of guys, I know we're going to get to this in a little bit, so I don't want to jump too much ahead, but, you know, the Hockey Canada stuff right now, and I'm thinking about this from the conversation I had this morning. We know the consequences in male cultures and in male groups of not going along with the dominant narrative in that sense, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so in that moment, we're making a trade-off of like, I want to belong to this group, this cohort, and so I'm going to bite my tongue. I'm going to hold my mouth, right? Like in a locker room, a lot of guys know that the thing that is happening is not good, but they don't have the culture or the wherewithal to stand up and say, I disagree with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of maybe like prattling on a little bit here, but I hope that we take away from the little exercise that I did there that guys know these things.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be invited, and I'd say even probably challenged to talk about it amongst ourselves, because these aren't women's issues, these are men's issues. That's where the stakeholder piece
Mm-hmm.
is.
I really like that you say that, because I get a little bit, obviously working in the DEI space of we'll just have, you know, all the little diverse groups can lead these initiatives and can be on the committee. And I think that's a problem for a variety of reasons. So I really like the idea of thinking about, you know, like that shift in leadership, of seeing, you know, leadership see men as stakeholders in the gender equity conversation. I really like that. I think that's really great. I'm really keen to get onto the Hockey Canada stuff, but first we're going to get through into Annika's actually going to lead this particular question, because it comes up a lot for her. So I'll hand it over to you, Annika.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, Jake, would love your perspective on the difference between, you know, mentorship and sponsorship. And I'll just say a little bit about how this comes up for us. Like Liz said, it comes up for Kristen and I in our work when we're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion reviews. We're speaking to leaders and employees and hearing how they perceive the differences between them and then their experience of it. So I'll just say what we hear often is sponsorship is more active. So a leader is using their position, their influence to advocate for, support, or remove barriers, and something happens usually. Somebody maybe gets a promotion. This idea of mentorship, formal or informal, whether it's a program or not, is softer. It's maybe advice, knowledge sharing, lessons learned. And interestingly, through the pandemic, we did work with a number of tech companies who wanted more women in leadership. And this is where we heard about this a lot, is there were mentorship programs that they were quite proud of, where male senior leaders were mentoring women. And the women's experience of it, for a number of them, was to learn how to be more like those men. So really curious what your perspective is, experiences of the difference and the impact.
Yeah, I don't want people leaving feeling like, oh, that guy just bashed the word allyship. But like, when we define it, people say it's a noun, it's a title, right? But to me, it's a verb, it's an action, like you said, right? It's something that we do. And to be an ally should cost you something, right? It should cost you your time, your money, your social capital. I often make the point, me being on this webinar positioned as an expert or a thought leader, it doesn't cost me anything. If anything, I'm gaining social capital right now. Like, this is an act of allyship, right? But when I'm going to the gym with my buddies and one of them, makes a misogynistic comment, roasting the other guy, me being like, hey man, not cool. Right. That's that moment. That's that hard moment of like, I don't want to lose social standing with these guys. How will they think about me and those types of things. Those are the moments where we need that allyship. And so when I think about this conversation about mentorship and sponsorship, again, I'm fresh from the talk this morning. There's a great clip of the U.S. soccer player Abby Wambach talking about the inequity within soccer in the United States and these types of things. And she's talked about how she was on a Zoom and, she kind of called out the leadership and was saying, we need to make this better, more equitable. Like, the women are winning, but the men are still overrepresented in leadership, and how not one man on that Zoom, spoke up with her. But that after the fact, she got, text messages and emails like, oh, I admire your courage and all these types of things. And then she called them out and she's like, that's silent solidarity. Like, you want the solidarity points of being like on my side, but like, you're not doing anything, right? Like, you're not visibly out there. Whereas like a sponsor is someone who's like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm going to like use my social capital, my power, my influence. I'm just going to mute for a second.
Hard to do this in a hotel lobby.
Sorry, there was a very loud cart. I'm sure you probably all heard it. But I'm going to use my influence, my positionality to right this wrong, right? Because I believe in it. And so when I think about mentorship and sponsorship, like, going for coffee or, giving advice or those types of things behind the scenes, like, it's nice, it's useful, it's helpful, but it is silent solidarity. You're not out there being a champion, right? When you're a sponsor, you're putting your capital, your positionality on the line for someone, being like, this person deserves this opportunity, this stretch goal. I think, I've been working with them and I these are their strengths, these are their weaknesses. I think that, despite those weaknesses, they'll succeed in this and it'll take them to the next level. And so I think that's the big change maker for me. And I think the tough part too, we talked about this a little bit and we don't need to get into the nitty gritty, but there's always trade-offs of like formalized, informalized, those types of things. But when I go to organizations and I ask in a mixed gender group, like, can you identify who your mentors are? All of the women absolutely can. This person did this for me. That person did that for me. This, and the guys can't think of it. But then when I ask them, who do you go out for beer with? Who do you go golfing with? Who do you play in the beer league hockey team with? They know those guys, and that's how they get the jobs, the opportunities, the exposure, right? And so I think we need to keep that in mind when there are these informal ones. How do we create those opportunities where people get to meet and connect, because they just wouldn't otherwise? Because one of my new favorite words that I've learned is this idea of homophily, right? We go around people who are much like ourselves. So, and that's, we can get into bias and these types of things, but that's just like a neurological evolutionary component, right? And so how do we overcome that and expose ourselves to these things where we get to be like, oh, I know Elisabeth, and that I'm willing to stick out my social capital, because if you don't, then it's just not going to happen.
Did you want to ask
I
something,
know
Liz?
we both opened our mouths at the same
Yeah.
time. Sorry, Annika. I was
And
just
I
gonna
have a question too. I have a question too.
I'll do mine really quickly. Listening to you talk today just really reminded me how, when we look at like the workplace and how we interact with each other, and that, going into work after work for drinks, or the beer league, or the golfing, from like a legal perspective, those still count as the workplace as far as like harassment and discrimination law goes, like in Canada at least. Those all form workplace areas. But we don't always think about that in terms of like the advancement of careers, or how we get to know people, or how we get considered for advancement or promotion. And there's so much research that shows that's a huge gap, where like those are the opportunities where people hear about potential promotions coming up and are able to build that social capital with folks to say like, oh, that is somebody that I trust. Like, they're a great guy. I've done that kind of stuff. And it's not something that women, are certainly not just women, but women like with children, or anybody with like a caregiver responsibility, struggles to go, to those quote unquote after work things to advance their careers like that. And that's an element that I think also requires some cultural change. So not just our understanding of, how we behave at work and in those sort of after work events, but in our expectations of what we think of, people actually being able to attend at work, I think is a challenging one. I'll hand it back over to you two so we don't burn through all of our questions.
If I just want to
Yeah.
add one thing on that. Like, there's no such thing as an individual outside of social structures, right? And so like we always have to look at the social structures. And so if the social structure as it is, with the motherhood penalty and women's engagement in childcare and like housework, the second shift, all those types of things, limits their opportunities to engage in those other social structures that then benefit their careers. Like, again, going back to the idea of like, am I an ally or am I a stakeholder? Like, if you want to write this, you need to be more engaged at home to advance equity in the workplace, right?
Kristen, what did you want to ask?
Something that Annika and I have talked about in the past, because we do hear this a lot. It comes up all the time in our focus groups. Should men be mentored by women? Because why is it always women being, I mean, I get it. We need to help women to get to the upper echelon in workplaces, but there just seems something off about this equation. Who's mentoring who?
Well, the research shows that men who have female leadership earlier in their careers later on have more equitable attitudes and become more equitable leaders themselves. And so I absolutely think mentorship needs to be cross genders, needs to be cross experience. I mean, now there's this whole idea of reverse mentorship. You got, these boomers hanging on to,
Right.
their jobs before they retire, and someone needs to show them how to edit a PDF, right? And that's a valuable work skill set,
Wait,
right?
can you edit a PDF?
Right. And I may have jokingly used boomers as a pejorative there, but like I just want us to like rethink this idea of mentorship, and again, not put it in this level of benevolence of like, I have the power and influence and I'm going to give you, a whiff of that. It's like,
Yeah.
it's this constant teacher learner positionality of like, I potentially have something to share with you, but you definitely have something to share with me. And I think that's transformative for organizations. My team's a small team of 6, and in many ways, we were chuckling about this before setting it up. I'm an idiot in many ways, and they support me and I support them, and our organizations and our business outcomes are better for it. We don't need to play in this constant hierarchy.
I think also looking at it in like a skills-based way, right? Like we talk about that when we look at promoting inclusive hiring and how we look at job descriptions and candidate skills. And rather than thinking of like, you know, this person embodies all of this and this is what I need to strive for to have this particular position, like looking at it in like a skills sharing kind of way. Because I think we're shifting away from that, like, you know, you've gone to school and you've got the piece of paper that has 4 years of you doing this. And rather we're seeing, you know, there's these kinds of different skills. And I think that kind of helps to level the playing field a little bit as well, and focuses on, you know, some of the individual ways that we're different and that we have certain skills that we, you know, we can advance as a group.
And the best role of a mentor is not you need to be more like me. It's you need to be the best version of yourself, right?
Right.
And we can think about that, like we're going to shift gears into the Hockey Canada stuff. A sports coach should not take this raw athlete and put them into like this one bucket. You need to be like this. It's like, what is this person's skills, natural talents, physical abilities, right? In a sports context, how do I maximize that within this system and structure, right? And I'm a former semi-pro athlete. Like I think about that, right? Like I'm 6'8", you know, you want me to be a power forward, you don't want me to be a point guard. So like, let me be the best power forward I can be, right? So I think that we got to think about that as well too. And the onus on us as coaches or leaders to be able to work dynamically across what comes into our organization and what is given to us to work with as well.
Thanks, Jake. I'll just say quickly before we transition to Hockey Canada is, you know, I'm so curious when we get to the Q&A for those on the webinar, if you're hearing any common themes. I certainly am in the first two questions, right, around this, and it plays out for Kristen and I in the diversity, equity, inclusion work around, I'll just paraphrase it to be what's active about this. You know, when are you using your social capital? What are you doing and what are you not doing? Very few people are willing to let go of something that serves them. I remember a CEO that we held the mirror up to around this notion of sponsorship. Who are your go-to people? And we had no continued work with him because that was so ingrained. And yet he'd asked us to help him increase the representation and experience and engagement of women in the organization.
This is I think an important point as well too. I think our sector has to reckon with this as well. Like if we think about a Venn diagram, right, and there's a little sliver in the middle where we overlap, right, and there's us as, you know, change leaders and D&I and these types of things, and there's these institutions and organizations and their prerogatives. I'll use the example from the conversation this morning. You're getting like all the fresh stuff that's just going through my brain. But this was a leader who wanted to reduce sexual violence, sexual assault, all those types of things. That's his prerogative. And he was working with the United States Marines, and they wanted to reduce it within their ranks because it harmed their mission readiness, right? And there's that little sliver in the Venn diagram. There's all these other things. So if he came into that space and he was like talking about American foreign policy or those types of things, he'd be kicked out in an instant, right? But there was that one thing that they could agree on, that they wanted to reduce this. And so that's really where I think that we need to think about when we're approaching these things is what are the things that we share and can work and collaborate on, and the pain points that we have, versus like focusing always on the things that we don't have shared, because otherwise we'll like it will cost us things. I've, you know, said the quiet part out loud and not been invited back as well too, but you know, how do we make progress?
Thanks, Jake.
All right, that's great. So I want to talk about Hockey Canada, but I'm going to share a little bit of background because we've got some folks that aren't necessarily from Canada and might not know about Hockey Canada. So it was discovered that Hockey Canada, this past summer, it was discovered that they'd settled some sexual assault allegations that were alleged against members of Canada's junior hockey team. I think even the folks that are joining us from the States are aware of how passionate most Canadians are about hockey and how it forms part of our national identity. And Canada wins a lot. We've done very well in hockey for the most part. We're usually top of the podium. So when this was discovered, the Minister for Sports suspended the federal funding to Hockey Canada and called for an audit to try and figure out whether taxpayer money had been used on those settlement payouts. And our standing committee on Canadian heritage also opened up an inquiry. And what that inquiry revealed was a history of sexual misconduct cases against Hockey Canada. And they found out that the organization had spent $7.6 million out of a national equity fund, which is essentially money from player registration fees. So kids across the country that are, paying their few bucks a month to play hockey, that money had been going basically to silence victims in settlement cases, right? And there was 21 sexual misconduct allegations since 1989 that had come forward. So there's a couple of issues that kind of come out of that. One is that these are settlements that have happened in private that have an NDA, like a non-disclosure agreement. So we're not getting the details of what has happened. We have a culture at Hockey Canada where they have covered up these allegations over years and years, and there's a pattern to that behavior that is a problem. So it's been made secret from everybody else, but everybody in the organization is pretty well aware of it. The folks, the young men that are playing, and I should say this is for the men's Canadian teams, not the women's hockey teams. A lot of the players that play for Canada go on to play in the NHL and have incredibly prosperous careers that otherwise would have hit the rails, at least for a little bit. So there's the fact that these things happened in secrecy with a settlement and NDAs, the overall culture of a cover-up and the secrecy, and an abuse of funds, which is an issue as well. So in this conversation, I was really hoping to look at the culture. I want to, get a sense of, like, what do we think is going on here? How do you address it? And what is a solution? How do we do that in a meaningful way? Also noting that, like, this is an organization that we can't really just blow up because it has a huge structure. It may get renamed or shifted. But yeah, how do we address this? And what does that solution look like? I'm curious on your thoughts, Jake.
Yeah. I'm going to say some stuff, and it's by no means to excuse or permit like the behavior, but two things that come up for me is the in all of these allegations, it's often like kind of the junior team, like it's not like the senior team, and these juniors, like men's prefrontal cortex finishes forming later than women's. And so like they don't have the same capacity of like risk and thought that other people who've had that thing develop there. And again, I'm not saying that to permit or excuse it. That's just a fact. But the problem, I think, is we always then jump on the athletes themselves, and they are culpable for how they show up, how they behave in these types of things. But the power in that institution is the coaches, the administrators, the leadership, right? And now we're seeing, the leadership is just being absolutely dragged. This is going to be a Harvard Business Review case study of like what not to do in terms of like risk mitigation and all these types of things, right? But I've spoken with some journalists and stuff about this. These players, they come, they rise up through the system, and they kind of move on. That coach usually is embedded in that system for years and years and years, and he gets to influence all of these young men and uphold that culture within the locker room, right? Like, why is there not more of a focus on those people who are the keepers of those types? That person has the ultimate power. You're dressing, you're not dressing. You're playing on the first line, you're playing on the third line, right? Like that person is ultimately responsible to that. And then beyond that, the coaches, like the governing body, is responsible for creating those systems and structures, right? And so these, we developed a course called Raising Next Gen Men. It's 8 to 10 hours of self-paced learning. It's for parents, coaches, teachers. We've had it, accredited by the Coaching Association of Canada as an external professional development credit. And if you are a coach for an NSO, a national sporting organization, or a PSO, provincial sporting organization, you have to get X amount of credits per year. And so many of them have to be from the coaching body, and some can be external. So why is this training not culturally every year embedded in those types of things, right? And the worst part is the conversation is so focused on, consent or bystander intervention and those types of things. And that's good and important. For me, these are always yes and conversations. It's never a no but. And we're not going far enough on the culture transformation. We can talk about compliance all we want, but how do we create a culture of care, right? And then we have to go really far up around that, because you can go to any guy and you can be like, if you saw a sexual assault happening, would you intervene? And the vast majority of them would say, yeah, totally, like that's wrong, let's not do that. But what is the culture that underpins the permissibility of sexual assault? It is language, it is locker room talk, it is, banter, it is the derogatory remarks that we don't nip in the bud. And we focus so much on, like, in that ultimate moment of this assault happening, will you step up? But we're not getting people to buy into, I will step up even when the stakes aren't that high, because the chances are the person who buys into the culture transformation absolutely will step up. But the person who buys into just the intervention piece might not nip that type of conversation in the bud, and let that kind of banter and stuff go. So again, like, I really don't want to come off as like, these boys just did what they were going to do. Like, I don't buy into boys will be boys. Like, absolutely, there's culpability and permissibility into that. But like, I think our focus really needs to be on the system that permits those things. We need to be soft on people, hard on systems.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those things where we have to do that very difficult thing of walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? Because I grew up with young boys that play hockey. I know what they think they can get away with. I watched them do it my entire childhood. There's individual responsibility there that they can't skate away from, pardon the pun. That's just part of it. They do come from a culture where that's permissible. You really just had to look at the hearings to watch all of those boards of directors who were privately being told, you're going to have to step down. Like, this is a dumpster fire. You need to give it up. And they didn't, like, until the very, very last minute. And to me, that speaks volumes that, you could have the prime minister and MPs publicly saying, what are you even thinking? Like, how can you even be in this position? You obviously have to go. We obviously need to change this, or we're going to have to change Hockey Canada, and we'll all of a sudden be saying Canada Hockey instead, because it's all going to have to shift. And there is a massive thing there. And I think it really speaks, to your point around, like, the coaching, and around, like, if we think about it in the workplace, it's around the leadership, around what is tolerated, especially when you have somebody in power as from the board all the way down, to coaching staff, of, the power that person has for those individual players' careers, and how they want that to be a stepping point to advance their careers. I think there's a lot that we need to do there. I think the thing that I found shocking about watching the Hockey Canada scandal unfold was that it went on for so long, that it was so, like, massive, but, like, such a secret, but also, like, a bit of a known secret. And then everybody, even though when it came out that these settlements were all put up, that it was sort of not as big of a thing. It was like, oh, these were like one-off instances that have happened. But I'm actually curious to hear, if anybody else has any comments or questions about, what's happened at Hockey Canada and how that relates to the culture, that we have when we think about gender equity, when we think about how we hold each other accountable, and when we think about how to shift change in perspective. If anybody is interested in that, feel free to unmute. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for an opportunity to chime in. Jake and I were kind of chatting privately. I know that Kristen knows this. I have a nephew that is currently on the roster of the LA Kings. And it's interesting to note and to feel the pressure as a family member, and my ability or not my ability to comment on the debacle at Hockey Canada. And I'm choosing to comment, but even within my family, even my nephew alone, right? We don't have a conversation. One of his buddies was actually, in attendance around that whole scenario that blew up. Basically, what I want to share is that, I watched my nephew, who was tagged by the system at 7 years of age. It was really creepy to know that a bunch of older men were watching this young guy. My sister's lesbian. She's absolutely been outstanding as a stand for protecting her son in the midst of that dynamic. And God only knows what goes on that's not been seen. But what I got to note was it was really uncomfortable for me to actually step into that system as a gay man, because in my history of sport, not semi-professional, Jake, but but at a national level in track and field. I played a couple different universities in football. But it scared me to watch the dynamic of toxic masculinity, some of the language some of these scouts talk about. But, my sister stepped in there all the time and basically said to these guys, A, you don't know what you're talking about, B, bullshit the commentary, but she was always the protective force behind this guy. So it is the system, right? I watched it for a long period of time that he was groomed into. This is a really outstanding human being. He's really, really amazing. But my heart goes out to him because I also sense and feel that he's under the gun to not say anything, to not even have a conversation with family about this. So it is the system that's daunting, that has its players, absolutely, they can't say a word. So yeah, it is a system, and it's got to change. It's absolutely got to change. And I'll continue to be a voice for that, even though I've got a little bit of skin in the game in relation to having a nephew who's on the roster of an NHL hockey team. So it's really tough stuff.
The silence of
Thomas. Go ahead,
sorry.
Jake.
The
Sorry,
silence
Elizabeth?
of
I was just saying thanks for sharing that, but Jake's going to take it from there.
You are so welcome.
the silence of players in the league has been astounding. Like, those are the people with the most power and privilege who could be, those allies that we need right now. But it's been astounding. So I feel for that. And Thomas, I think, that perspective, that personal relation and those types of things. And this is really what I hope to get across in my conversations. In the introduction, it was read that Next Gen Men's vision is a future where boys and men feel less pain and cause less harm. So we lead with empathy for the experiences of boys and men around, suicide and mental health and isolation and all those kinds of things. But we then follow with accountability of the causing less harm and the things that we then, have this lateral violence. And so I think, you're leading with such empathy for your nephew, for his experience, for the experience of boys that grow up into players like him. But you also are grappling with this idea of accountability of the system and the structure and the outcomes there as well too.
And in this instance, we're talking about, young athletes who are phenomenal, but we're also talking about minors and how we care for them, right? Gabby made the comment about, we're seeing the same thing in soccer right now, with Barbarata being sentenced yesterday, and looking at that. And actually, prior to joining this call, I was talking about how I actually have a bunch of friends that were involved with that, that played for him, and he was a gatekeeper to people getting onto Team Canada. So whether you were going to complain about him and the power that he had with the Whitecaps, and then with Soccer Canada, and being able to advance your career was significant. And we don't really have a process to be able to address that. Like, a lot of those athletes' choices were just to kind of keep quiet and then try and advance their careers and get away from him and try and play in other places, which is what a lot of them did. But that's a huge risk for them. In the workplace, we address some of that stuff, with whistleblower legislation and looking at, ways to, have people develop, a sense of safety or anonymity and reporting something that's an issue and hoping that it gets exposed. We don't have that in sports. We're certainly seeing now the need to have that and to look at how that's governed, and how that can adjust the culture. But it's a major thing that we need. Kristen, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really valuing this conversation, and I've just been thinking so much about this, the stuff with the gymnastics in the US and now in Canada, this pervasive culture of abuse in sport, which I know is also happening. We're seeing it in workplaces too. So, to Liz's point around whistleblower policies. But to go back to this, the Whitecaps coach that was just sentenced yesterday, a friend of mine on Facebook had, I think his daughters had played soccer, and he knew of this coach. And he had put this post on yesterday about, how glad he was that this person was sentenced. And he also said that there had been rumors for years. Mm-hmm. And I just think, again, how do we turn our backs on rumors? Mm-hmm. If we think that, people are being harmed, how do we just say, well, maybe it's not true? Maybe it is true.
Mhm.
So Jake, I'm wondering, because you've sort of touched on this a little bit already, you know, and then the talk about allyship, and in particular, I love what you said about it has to cost you something, right? There has to, you got to have some skin in the game. So how do we encourage people to, you know, even if it's just a rumor, sometimes, you know, to pull out all these cliches, sometimes where there is smoke, there is fire.
Go ahead, Robert. I was going to pass it to you. I'll wait.
Hello, hi everybody.
Hi, Robert.
I have a question. I'm not sure what you mean by it's got to cost you something. What do you mean by that?
So, you know, if I think about, like, there's different levels of allyship as well too, right? There's individual, there's interpersonal, and there's the, like, organizational, systemic, whatever we want to call that, right? And so individually, like the example that I used was, you know, I have this friend group and we work out and we train together and we play basketball together, and one guy to the group is a bit newer, and with the other guys have great rapport and we're working him in. And there was one morning where we were doing this stuff and we were talking about this basketball tournament coming up, and the new guy roasted one of the older guys that he got put on a co-ed team because he played like a girl or something like that. And there was like a couple like that, and so I said, hey man, like, not cool. And so then, you know, I put our new relationship and the group dynamic on the line, which could have cost me something. The good news is he received the feedback and he rose to the occasion. So that's maybe like an example of an individual piece. Go ahead, Robert.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I know nothing about sport, and I took my son to basketball 2-3 weeks ago. It's like a friendly game thing, and he didn't want to play anymore. So I volunteered to be a coach, right? So the deal was I'll be a coach and he'll play basketball. And I said something, I saw that the kids were kind of, some of the other teams were very physical. And I said, why don't we tough but gentle, right? And everyone kind of laughed, but everyone took it to heart. And the team that I was coaching wanted to be tough but gentle. When a kid accidentally bumped another kid, no one went to see if the kid was okay. So I said, no, we stop the game and everyone goes to make sure that kid is okay, right? And the last 2 weeks, all the other teams are being more caring of each other than not. Now, the interesting thing is I apparently, what do you call it? How do you phrase it? There was a cost to my speaking out.
Yeah, there could have been a cost.
Right, but couldn't it be seen as a reverse? What's the cost if I don't speak out?
Exactly. Yeah. But
that was my calculation. If I don't speak out, I'll just perpetuate this behavior.
Yeah, 100%. And I love that you brought that up. The problem is we can't measure a negative, something that didn't happen, right?
No, but it did happen.
No. But if you didn't speak out, we can't measure that. That's the tough part. But you did. You made the investment, and it did cost you something, and you got a return on the investment. But you could have made the investment and lost it as well too, right? Sorry. Go ahead, Robert.
It's okay. The thought is this: so a behavior happens, right?
Yeah.
And if I don't say something, you could. I understand what you're saying, but how could you measure if I don't say something? But if you don't say something, the likelihood that it's going to continue is going to actually be very, very high. So you can actually measure the potential for that thing to propagate.
Yeah. If I can offer, because I could probably go back and forth with you on the semantics of this. There's a different framework that maybe I think we can definitely agree on with this, where I often say that we overvalue what it is we might lose and we undervalue what it is we might gain. So we overvalue, the ability to say whatever we want, have the locker room banter, those types of things, but we undervalue the mental health, the healthy relationships, the ability to be vulnerable, the psychological safety, right? And so that's, I think, what you're scratching at is like this thing that we can unleash when we make that investment. And like as a structure and as a system, we don't have the culture that talks about that yet. But I love your example, and especially how you played that out. And I'll go on a bit of a rant here, Kristen. You might have to remind me of your initial question, but sports, like I'm 6'8", former semi-pro basketball player. Like that, this is the culture that I grew up in. A coach is often, so one, like we have a culture where men are often barred from engaging with youth. There's, if there's, a guy in like early childhood education, there's often inferences of around his sexuality, whether he's a pervert, like there's a nasty culture around that. Sports is one space where men don't face that type of pushback. And when we introduce children to the world of sports, if they have a male coach and they're a boy, that male coach might be one of their first male role models outside of their family unit, because early childhood education, like I just said, is dominated by women. And so the culture, either he sees multiple masculinities that are different from his father, his uncle, his, men in his community, or he sees another man who embodies a lot of traditional masculinity and then embodies that as well too. So coaches have such a powerful role in sport as well. And then I think about, I'm very pro sport still. Like competition can be really great. It brings out the best in people, but so many coaches abuse it and turn it into a culture of domination. And like one of the best examples for me, and like, I love you're tough but gentle, right? Like if it was just, oh, we need to be physical, we need to be tough, like it's hit the kid and don't pick him up. But like competitively, you can go at a guy all game long, shake hands and be like, great battle. Like that's awesome, right? But then if it's this culture of domination, like one of my favorite examples was recent. If you saw Roger Federer's retirement, and him and Rafael Nadal are sitting beside each other holding hands. Rafael isn't retiring and he's crying and he's like, a piece of me is leaving this game. Like that's such beautiful competition. And like, how do we have a culture and a system and coaches that support athletes to move towards that idea of competition in sport? That's really what I think is beautiful. And Robert, I think you're contributing to it with the actions that you're taking there.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And obviously, Robert, I'm loving your approach. I think that's a really good one. I think what really stands out to me, if I look at, this sporting world, both as an employer and then think about workplaces separately to that, is that we've created these gatekeepers, and it's those gatekeepers that have control over the careers of those young kids, or whether or not they get to play, even if it's just at a really junior level. And we do the same thing in the workplace. And if we have that one person that's a gatekeeper and we don't have a system set up to be able to protect the interests of everyone, then we have a problem, right? And that's where we get into that, we've deemed it like whistleblower. Probably not the language we want to use, because there's a lot of, I think, like negative connotations around that as well that we need to be mindful of. But looking at, what is the net that we have around people in that position? Because asking one person to be a coach and be, particularly good at what it is that they do in terms of the game and how they play, and be responsible for role modeling, what it means to be a man or a woman or a decent person to young people, and be responsible for keeping an eye on their mental health and how, like, it's just too much for that one person. So we need to look at, I think, shifting our approach out of that. And at different levels, that looks like different things, I think, in terms of, for Robert and his kid, and like looking at parent involvement and having those responsibilities spread out. In the workplace, it might be, an anonymous hotline that goes to HR, but then you also have other people that, you're hopefully in like a mentor or sponsor relationship that you can go to, or you have, like an employee resource group that you can share feedback with, like having multiple opportunities. Because when we just have one spot that's supposed to be responsible for all those things and has that kind of authority, particularly over vulnerable people, and I would suggest that a lot of employees are vulnerable people, either by their demographic or by the mere fact that they don't want to lose their paycheck. We need to be more mindful over how we're protecting and being aware of those different groups. And I think when we do that, that's when we have the power to shift a little bit of the culture. And I think that's what we've seen in Hockey Canada, is there's been just a desire to see certain outcomes and to look up, like close a blind eye to other things that are happening for a variety of different reasons. I think that's where we need to shift a little bit of those pieces as well.
it's what are our priorities, right?
Yeah.
Because their priority was creating a fund separate to cover their asses when the worst case scenario happens. But if they even took that amount of money and invested it in primary prevention around those types of things, like you won't have those problems, right? And so it comes around the prioritization piece. But I saw Ken's hand go up.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ken.
Sorry, I got a bit of noise happening by me. I hope it's not going to drown me out. But what baffles me the most out of the Hockey Canada fiasco is that nobody said no. There had to be so many people who knew about it. You can't just hide that kind of money being spent. You know, you gather around the boardroom table and you talk about where money's going, and so much money went. I can't understand that someone didn't have the integrity to say, no, we can't do this. And I think it would only take one.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, they're just baffling, full stop, right? Promoting that poor girl to being the chair of the board, then having her say all that nonsense, and then she quit like the next day. Like, it's shocking behavior, and hopefully it gets resolved in a reasonable kind of way. I'm mindful that we're coming to the end of our session, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'm wondering if anybody has another question for Jake, or another comment that they'd like to make before we wrap things up.
One comment that I can, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can we reach out to Jake? And yes, in a minute, I'm going to share contact information. But Shweta, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always think about in these scenarios is that, how do we shift the things that what we value, right? Like here, obviously in this and in a lot of the workplaces, what we see is, especially coming from science, like, the creative genius, or whatever you want to call the person who's pulling the most grants or whatever, are so highly valued that they can basically get away with anything. The brilliant a-hole, if you pardon my language, can basically get away with anything that they want, and no one seems to think about. And I like your idea of prevention or mitigation, but for whatever reason, we don't seem to be very, very good at thinking about risk mitigation, right? So why is that? Like, from a psychological perspective, why are we so poor at risk mitigation? Or like, even like broadly as a society, we seem to be way more focused on treatment than prevention, right? So any ideas on that?
I think a lot of it has to do with like, and I think this is a little bit of the sticking point Robert and I were going back on. You can't measure what didn't happen. So Next Gen Men's going to be 8 years old this month. I can't tell you how many suicides we've prevented or how many sexual assaults we've prevented because it didn't happen. I can tell you who we engaged in those types of things, but we've built a system and a structure. Especially, I'm a nonprofit, like where we fund things on these like tangible results and those types of things. And then I think about the gender-based violence space, how limited funding there is for women's shelters, survivor serving organizations, those types of things. And then I come in and be like, yeah, let's spend money engaging boys in prevention, those types of things. Like there's often not necessarily an appetite for that conversation. And so how do we further that conversation where we're not just pulling people out of the river, we're walking up the bank and we're saying, why are there so many people falling in the river in the first place, right? And so Shweta, I don't think I have like the answer, but it is a huge issue, and I'm hoping that through having more and more of these conversations, we can really start to get more to the root of it. And for me, like one of the guiding principles for Next Gen Men, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's this Bell Hooks quote from Will to Change. And she says, the first act of violence that patriarchy asks of men is not that against women, but that against themselves. And should they fail to psychologically and emotionally cripple themselves, they'll be met by a group of men that will do it for them. And for me, that's where I want to work, is to prevent that first act of violence, because I see a lot of this as lateral violence that spills out of that.
Wow. I think that's a pretty amazing and powerful quote to end on, because we are at time. This hour has flown by, and I just want to say thank you so much, Jake, for spending the time with us and sharing your your experiences and perspectives. And to everyone for joining us today, a really, really wonderful conversation and contributions. And just remember, you know, it takes a village. So let's all support each other to create a more equitable, inclusive world. So thank you and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jake.
My pleasure. Yeah, it was a great discussion.
Yeah, I think
I have to jump off because I've got another webinar to go to. Jake, you are a freaking rock star. I can't wait to meet you in person one day. Like, let's go for coffee or lunch, like the four of us. That would be amazing. Thank you. Really.
Sounds good. My pleasure. It's an honor.
Thanks, Jake. Enjoy your travels. Travel safe.
Cheers.
Stay healthy. And I'll see you
Bye.
soon.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye.